Thanks very much, everybody. This has been, I'm going to present a small snippet of a larger project where we've been looking at the relationship between bushfire risk and biodiversity conservation and the perceptions of those two, risk on one hand and values on the other. And I'm going to focus in relation to thresholds in bushfire risk and the key threshold of, is climate change driving changed perceptions of bushfire risk, and will that alter in time people's attitudes towards the native vegetation in South Australia? This has been a very collaborative project across two natural resource management boards, the then DUNA, now DEW, Adelaide University and the University of South Australia, with funding from the Australian Research Council. So I'm going to focus on climate change, and climate change affects society in a whole range of ways, and we've been hearing a lot of those. But a lot of those changes might not be so dramatic or influence policy so much unless they reach a point of severity where we start to see dramatic changes in attitudes or perceptions that drive changes to policy. And we've started to see that in relation to bushfire risks. The attitudes to bushfire risk 10 years ago are different to the attitudes to bushfire risk now. And that's primarily driven by a number of factors, but one of them is climate change. So when we did some work over a decade ago now, doing an integrated assessment of climate change impacts on natural resource management within this region here, Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges, we identified that climate change will drive bushfire risk, and it's going to be one of the major challenges, but we're going to have adaptive capacities. There are going to be things we're going to be able to do. We're going to be able to change behaviours. We're going to increase our urban development approaches to mitigate risk. We're going to have prescribed burning. All these things are methods that we can apply to mitigate risk. The problem is if they're hindered by other factors, if there are constraints on our adaptive capacity, if we don't have enough money, that's often the challenge. If politically it's unacceptable to put in place changes to our planning laws so that we don't develop some areas, if we alter prescribed burnings in different ways, it's these issues which might be really important. And so climate change is clearly a key factor, but a whole lot of other issues are coming in. Within the peri-urban area of the Mount Lofty Ranges, we've seen suburbs. A lot of them were developed in the 1960s, 1970s. They were largely developed in agricultural areas. Might have been old horticulture or dairy areas. There wasn't much vegetation around. 40, 50 years on, the vegetation has come back into those suburbs. So we've got a changed vegetation management history, and more people are continuing to live up in those peri-urban areas in between the city and rural landscape. So there's a whole lot of factors that are changing people's attitudes to how risky they feel within these settled landscapes. So we've been, in our work, we've been interested in this idea of thresholds in relation to risk. And we're familiar with climatic thresholds. People talk about, for example, the step change in rainfall in Western Australia, this non-linear change in rainfall. There are a whole lot of climatic thresholds or biophysical thresholds that we talk about. But they're also, importantly for adaptation, are going to be societal or social thresholds to change. These non-linear societal responses to any given environmental stimulus, or even a perception of that stimulus. It might not occur. It might be that you know it from somewhere else, like the fires in California or Portugal have concerned you here. It might not have happened here. It might just be the perception of that risk which is important. And so in that case, you might get sudden dramatic changes in perceptions or practices that have the potential to undermine good policy. They might be knee-jerk reactions. They might be sudden, substantial political requirements that are being driven by the population saying, no, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We want to have much better protection, and that means clearing the vegetation more, or burning it more, or not putting those suburbs up in different ways. So in part of this work with DUNA has been looking at, has a threshold of perception actually passed in South Australia in relation to bushfire risk? And if so, will this affect people's conceptions of vegetation and how they think vegetation should be managed into the future? Probably you could argue that this isn't going to be a problem if perceptions of risk, until perceptions of risk massively exceed perceptions of value. Because people love their places. We've done other work, which I won't present today, that have been key to understanding places and why people live in areas like the Lower Eyre Peninsula or the Mount Lofty Ranges. It's because they love the vegetation, they love those places. Are we, however, going to get a situation where that attraction gets trumped by the risks that people feel? We did a large survey, almost 1,000 people in Lower Eyre Peninsula and in the Mount Lofty Ranges, asking these questions. I'm going to present a small snippet of the results. What we found is there are three dominant groups in relation to perception of wildfire or bushfire risk and climate change. Group one, they're very aware of climate change is altering wildfire risk to their property, and they've made conscious changes in relation to their bushfire or wildfire prevention plans as a result. They're doing things. They're adjusting their livelihoods, their behaviours, their investments to respond to risk. That's about a third of a group. The second group is aware of climate change, but they're not enacting changes. Another third don't really recognise that climate change is a real risk and are not so concerned about vegetation and conservation anyway. I want to provide a little bit more detail on these three risks, these three groups, because they're quite interesting. This first group we called an action group. They're activating their bushfire action plans. They're generally more rural, on larger blocks. They've generally ranked their knowledge of biodiversity very highly, and they're very attached to their region. They're very concerned about it, and they're active within their region. They're more likely to have experienced a bushfire, and they're generally supportive of the current balance between bushfire management and vegetation and conservation across South Australia. There's a